again, on behalf of the President and the First Lady, welcome you to this forum on drug control. Again, I want to express the gratitude that all of us here in the administration and in the communities represented and from the whole country, the gratitude that all of us feel to Mayor Rich Daley for his leadership in selecting this topic as a primary focal point for the Conference of Mayors and in bringing together so many people from around the country to really focus on this. I mentioned earlier that practically the whole cabinet is here this morning, and Mr. President, I acknowledged each one of them by name earlier, so I will not do that again, but they have been actively participating at each of the tables in a discussion about this topic, and we want to welcome, along with Mayor Daley, all of the other mayors who are present, and forgive me for not mentioning all of you by name, there are simply too many. And let me also mention as a group the prosecutors who are present, the police chiefs and police officers and officials who are present, and the many federal officials with law enforcement and drug control agencies who are present. Here's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks and then ask General Barry McCaffrey, the President's point man on this issue, our drug control czar, to come up to the podium and set the stage here. And he will then introduce Mayor Daley. Mayor Daley will make remarks and introduce the President. And after the President's remarks, we'll have an open Q&A session and a full-blown discussion of what needs to be done and what is being done, how we need to proceed from here. But the message that this whole group is sending to the country is very, very clear. We must reduce drug abuse and its devastating consequences on our society, and we will not rest until we do. We have been working mighty hard to bring federal policies into alignment with that goal. And General McCaffrey has been reporting to the President on a regular basis and helping to coordinate all of the agencies and departments that are represented here in the room today. Drug abuse knows no boundaries. No community is unique. Drugs threaten citizens in our largest cities and our smallest towns, and some of both are represented in this gathering here today. And that's why all of us are approaching this forum not just as another chance to pound the table, but rather as an opportunity to pound the problem. We really don't have a second to waste, because if you just glance briefly at the facts, it's abundantly clear that this really deserves the kind of intense focus that we're giving it. Drugs cost our nation an estimated $67 billion every single year. Also, about a third of the new AIDS cases are directly linked to drug users who inject themselves with needles. More than 1 million Americans are arrested each year because of violations of drug law. 14,000 people die each year because of drug use. And perhaps most disturbing of all, drug use among our children has been going up for the past 5 years. The average age at which alcohol, cigarettes, and illegal drugs is first used has been dropping for more than a decade. Just recently, we've begun to see some improvement in these statistics. We've begun to see the first signs of a turnaround, but still 68 million children are at risk. In other words, we know that the costs exacted by drug abuse on our country are totally unacceptable. We know that the more available drugs are, the more likely they are to be used. And we know, in fact, we've made it the centerpiece of the President's national anti-drug effort. We know that the resurgence of drug use puts at risk our nation's most precious resource, our children. There's another fact, one that's proved to be true every time the United States of America has faced a challenge. We know, above all else, that when Americans work together, we get things done. And that's why we're here. Washington alone cannot solve this problem. Local communities alone cannot solve this problem when drugs wash across their boundaries from elsewhere. But we will move in the right direction if we travel on common ground and work together toward the same goals. And that's what our communities and our children deserve. That's what we're determined to give them. It is now my privilege to present to you a person whose commitment to combating drugs and protecting our children is legendary. He used to run Southcom and is a leading expert in how to interdict drugs that are being smuggled from other countries, and he has become an expert on the full spectrum of these issues: prevention, and there are a lot of service providers here, incidentally, law enforcement, the diplomacy that's necessary in the source countries, all of the punishment issues, really across the board. General Barry McCaffrey has made it his business to develop the expertise that our country needs, and the one person who reports directly to the President on a daily basis about this problem. And it's my privilege to ask him to come up to the microphone here now, General Barry McCaffrey.
Thanks, Mr. Vice President. I normally attribute to the Vice President, and it's actually not true, sort of a standard gag line that he counseled me when I was being interviewed for this position, not to worry about whether I'd have friends when I left public office. That I'd have the same number of friends when I left that when I got there. The only difference is they'll have different names. And Mr. President, I hope the mayors are the new friends that I'm putting together. A lot of important people in the room. Donna Shalala, Janet Reno, Richard Riley, Andy Como, Slater, you name it. 14 of us that are in the President's Drug Cabinet Council for the last year have been trying to put together a sensible plan that the President then put in front of the American people as a national drug control strategy. There's no intellectual breakthrough in Western thinking here. What this plan represents is what you already know. If you're going to confront the drug issue, you got to focus on kids. You got to prevent drug use in 68 million American children. You got to go to the 4 million Americans who are addicted and do something about it. And at the same time, you have to support law enforcement. You have to do interdiction. You can't pick one of them. You have to do the 5 goals of the National Drug Strategy. And oh, by the way, you have to pay for it. So what the President and Frank Raines sent down to Congress last year was the largest drug budget in history, 9.4% increase. That's modest amounts of money. That was a modest expenditure on a problem that cost you and I $70 billion. And that's in directly attributable costs. It's a tremendous challenge. We're now going to follow up with a 98 budget. We're going to ask for, again, for bipartisan support. It's another 5.4% increase, and the money's going where the strategy said it should. The President approved a 21% increase in programs focused on children, focused on trying to prevent the next generation of the addicted. We think we're on the right track. Now, in addition, Mr. President, if you would allow me to sort of highlight for your consideration, the mayors came here with a national action plan to control drugs, and they've been working on it for months. Scott King, Brent Coles, Nancy Graham at our table, Dennis Archer, around the country, I've been following their dialogue, their debate, their learning experience on how are we, the federal government, going to line up to better support these men and women in public office who are directly responsible for confronting the real problems of drug abuse. We think their national action plan supports your national strategy and makes sense. It's a solid piece of work, and it also starts with the preposition that you've got to confront drug prevention programs among American youngsters. Now let me, if I may, end with 2 notes, and they're sort of brief notes. We had a marvelous speaker yesterday at noon, Milton Cree, very inspirational. He went right to the heart and soul, probably, of one of the most distasteful problems of drug abuse in America: dysfunctional families, parents who are using crack cocaine, multi-generational families that are broken down and are in their 2nd generation of drug sales. Let me add to his presentation, though. I endorse his words, but I want us to be a little cautious. The problem of drug abuse in America isn't something that's confined to that subpopulation. Drug abuse in America is 12 million out of 265 million of us. Most of us don't use drugs, but 12 million do. Most of them are white. Most of them are employed. 7 out of 10 are employed. And so when you talk about the problems of drug abuse, it isn't marginalized. It isn't somebody else's kids. It's our children. It's our employees. It's our teammates. The drug abusers who are employed are 3 times more likely to be late for work, 10 times more likely to miss work, 3.6 times more likely to injure themselves. They have 300% higher medical costs, and they're a third less productive. This is a major problem in America, and it's marijuana use along with other drugs. So again, if you would allow me to broaden the concern, if you wonder whose kids are threatened by drugs, it's yours. It's not somebody else's. Now, a final thought, because there's a temptation in every discussion on the drug problem to go to the most visible manifestations of it, and the mayors see it. I mean, if you are unemployed, if you don't have a church, if you don't have a solid family structure, and you're addicted, you're on the streets, you're HIV positive, you're involved in prostitution, you're involved in crime, you're involved in the criminal justice system. But a lot of this problem's in the suburbs. If we go ask who's smoking crack, who's using drugs in America, the quasi-legalized open-air market may be in a central city. It may be an African-American male selling it, but the customers are from the suburbs. Now, we've got to remind ourselves of this specifically, that in 1993, and I use Janet Reno's statistics, 88% of the people arrested for or sentenced for crack cocaine were black, 95.4% non-white. However, in 94, different years, same notion, a larger percentage of whites, 18 to 25, are using crack cocaine than blacks in the same age group. And in 94, if you compared the population between age 12 and 34, a far larger percentage of whites use cocaine than blacks. Now, I mention this again because I don't think drug abuse in America is an urban problem as opposed to a rural problem. It's not a minority problem. It doesn't even necessarily relate to income. I mean, we know anesthesiologists have as high as a 10% addiction rate during their lifetime to alcohol and legal narcotics and illegal narcotics. It's a problem that we all have to face up to, and I want to remind ourselves of that so we don't get focused on the most visible and probably the least tractable problem. Mayor Daley and his 2 co-chairs, I just got to explicitly, Mr. President, recognize their leadership. There's sort of a modern breed of mayors in America right now. You talk about heroic behavior. They step forward, they volunteer to confront these problems. And I've been to his 2 co-chairs' cities in Gary, Indiana, and Boise, Idaho, and they're completely different environments. There's nothing in common except both these fellows have stepped forward to try and confront the issues. I'm enormously proud of Mayor Daley's leadership, not just in Chicago, but his example for the country. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, General McCaffrey, President Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, members of the Cabinet, mayors, police chiefs, service providers, and prosecutors. To begin with, I want to thank the President for inviting us again to the White House, and to thank General McCaffrey, his staff, and the Cabinet for having this national forum, I think is the first time, whereby you have put local officials, the police chiefs and the mayors and the prosecutors and service providers to work with your Cabinet. And this is the first, I think, in 25 or 30 or 40 years, and let's all give the President a round of applause and thank him. And no other president has done this for 25 or 30 years. And General McCaffrey has stated We need a new national attitude about fighting drug violence. And mayors and local officials across the nation are committed to the national strategy. And we are pleased that you have given us the national forum to outline some of our ideas and recommendations. Mr. President, you should be commended for picking a national drug czar, one who is committed to action, who understands the importance of tackling this problem. It's a very complex problem, and there are no easy solutions. We know that drugs are destroying communities across this nation and the world. They're tearing families apart and destroying the lives of children. The drug trade is a national problem, and one that has been with us for many years. But we understand locally, 95% of all arrests and prosecution are local, as well as incarceration. It did not begin 4 or 5 years ago. This administration has tried, other administrations have tried and failed to get a handle on this. But your administration has taken this as a national priority. Yesterday, we had a chance to speak with members of your cabinet and to send a clear message that we are committed to a national drug control strategy. This is one of the highest priorities for local officials, especially mayors across the nation, because no city, town, or community in this country is free from the threats of illegal drugs. We are asking national leaders to step up to the plate and take action. Yesterday, we approved a specific federal action plan to reach young people and keep them away from drugs, to use the full power of the federal government, including the tax code, IRS, to crack down on drug dealers and money launderers, to aggressively prosecute international drug traffickers and financiers, to promote drug-free workplaces in the public and private sectors, and to make illegal drugs a top foreign policy concern, putting the full force of the international standing into influence to stop the world drug trade. This is an ambitious agenda, one that needs a firm commitment from your administration and Congress. The time for action is now. Our national failures to control illegal drugs year after year is obvious. Several months ago, I rode around with the Chicago Police Department, Matt Rodriguez, to different communities. And too often, we do encounter open-air drug markets. Street dealers at these markets are selling drugs that weren't grown in Chicago or any other American city. They reach the streets after a long process of smuggling, trading, laundering, repackaging. Each step of the way, a federal law is being violated, and the result is a pile of problems dumped on our doorsteps. Cities have to deal with the burglaries and thefts committed by addicts to support their habit, and the violent crimes committed by dealers to protect their turf. Domestic violence is inflicted by drug users. The problems of our youth, from teenage pregnancy, truancy, and high dropout rates caused by drug abuse. Absenteeism and loss of productivity in the workplace. And that is why every step of the drug trade must be met with the full force and effect, not just of the federal government, but the state and local governments in this entire nation. Mr. President, on behalf of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, I'd like to present to you our national action plan to control drugs. And I pledge to you that nation's mayors, prosecutors, police chiefs, and service providers are committed to this action. We urge you, of course, to review the document and to seek our commitment and our partnership. And now it's my great honor to introduce the President of the United States. Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Mayor Helmke and the other officers of the Conference of Mayors, General McCaffrey, Mr. Vice President, the members of the Cabinet and the Administration, all of you who are here. First, let me thank you for participating in what, as Mayor Daley said, is a fairly unprecedented, long-term, consistent effort at cooperation with all these federal agencies to try to work through a united approach to this issue. It occurred to me that as I was coming here, that one of the things I ought to say is that all the objectives that all of us have for our country depend in part upon our being able to give our children a drug-free future. I came here saying that I wanted to be president because we needed to change America for the 21st century to make sure opportunity would be available for all people. It's by definition not there for people who are too paralyzed to take advantage of it. To make sure that all citizens would be responsible contributors to a community becoming more united. Drugs divide America in all kinds of ways that you're very familiar with, and by definition represent irresponsibility. And I wanted our country to be a leader in the world for peace and freedom and prosperity, and it's hard for America to lead when we're fighting all the time over the drug issues. And we certainly do. I just got back from a trip to Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and at each stop along the way it was a big point of our discussions. So it's important that you're here. A lot of you were just at the President's Summit of Service in Philadelphia. And we said we were going to try to create communities in which every child in this country by the year 2000 would have a safe place, a decent, healthy start in life, access to a good education and marketable skills, a mentor trying to help him or her, and have the chance to serve themselves, our children. We can't do any of that unless these kids have a drug-free future. So this is very, very important. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, I'd also like to say a special word of thanks to someone who has worked with you on our behalf for over 4 years now. This is Marcia Hale's last day on the job, and I think we ought to say to her she has done a magnificent job representing the mayor. Thank you. Thank you. She leaves for London tomorrow. She's going to work for a great American company, and as nearly as I can tell, she will soon be in a position to support me in my old age. And so we wish her well. Let me say that also I want to thank all of you for the work you've done with the Attorney General and with our other law enforcement officials in trying to drive down the crime rate. We can be very pleased with what has happened when we've had more police, more punishment, more prevention in our communities with a community-based strategy. One of the chiefs of police I met today said that the COPS program had been the best thing the federal government had done in his 37 years in law enforcement. And I appreciate that. You all know that the crime rate has dropped for 5 years in a row, and we learned last week at the annual observance of at the Law Enforcement Memorial that we had the fewest number of police officers killed last year in the line of duty in 35 years. And all those are good signs. We've also had some success in the fight against illegal drugs. Monthly drug use today is about half of what it was 10 years ago. But what we have to face is, and I was glad General McCaffrey said what he did, is that we have had this anomalous situation in America for the last several years where crime is going down, but crime among juveniles is going up. Drug use among young adults, which used to be the biggest problem category, 18 to 35, going down. Drug use among juveniles going up. And that is the thing I think that is plaguing all of us. This report you have given, I think, is very, very instructive about what we can do. And I want to talk a little more about what we can do together. But I think it's also important to point out that this problem is the problem of every American citizen. It goes beyond the responsibilities of even the President and the Attorney General and the drug czar and the DEA and the mayors and even the people who are involved in prevention and treatment. Our society cannot say on the one hand we want to have a tough, intolerant attitude toward drugs, and on the other hand send a very different message every time there might be a little money to be made out of it. And I want to say specifically, there have not been consistent and unwavering messages. You know, a lot of you have experienced in your communities the increasing allure of heroin among young people. We've seen a lot of communities where cocaine use goes down, heroin use comes up. For most people in our generation, those of you who are, a lot of you are younger than I am, but most of you about my age, we all grew up thinking heroin was the worst thing in the world. There were these horrible images associated with it. Strung out junkies lying on street corners in decidedly unglamorous ways. But we now see in college campuses and neighborhoods heroin becoming increasingly the drug of choice. And we know that part of this has to do with the images that are finding their way to our young people. In the press in recent days, we've seen reports that many of our fashion leaders are now admitting, and I honor them for doing this, they're admitting flat out that images projected in fashion photos in the last few years have made heroin addiction seem glamorous and sexy and cool. And as some of the people in those images start to die now, it's become obvious that that is not true. You do not need to glamorize addiction to sell clothes. And American fashion has been an enormous source of creativity and beauty and art and, frankly, economic prosperity for the United States. And we should all value and respect that. But the glorification of heroin is not creative, it's destructive, it's not beautiful, it is ugly. And this is not about art, it's about life and death. And glorifying death is not good for any society. And I hope that we have all come to recognize that now, because none of us are going to succeed unless all of us work together on this problem. Let me say that I also recognize that we have more to do here. The balanced budget agreement that we have reached with the Congress, and which received overwhelming support from members of both parties in the House of Representatives last night, I'm very, very proud of it, will allow us to continue to increase our efforts to work with you to do our part of the job. And I agree with what Mayor Daley said. We have a lot of things to do here, including improving the coordination between what we do and what you do. Among other things, General McCaffrey has succeeded in making the case for a $175 million advertising campaign, which will be leveraged with private sector resources to give our children the hard facts about drugs. I think that is very important. We have a lot of evidence that drug use does go down or up depending upon the absence or presence of certain messages and a certain cultural environment about it. There are also two other things I'd like to mention because they were mentioned specifically, Mr. Mayor, in your plan. First, we have some good news to report in our progress about methamphetamines. Last year, we targeted this increasingly popular drug as a special focus for our efforts. Meth has a devastating effect on those who use it. It is produced in clandestine labs, which carry an enormously high risk of fire and explosion. The Congress supported our efforts by enacting the Comprehensive Methamphetamine Control Act, establishing new controls over the chemicals used to make meth, and strengthening penalties for trafficking in those chemicals. Now, a year later, we are releasing a one-year progress report. First, seizures of dangerous drug labs used to manufacture meth are up 170% in 1 year alone. Second, the use of methamphetamine is down in key western cities. In 8 of the 10 cities where meth use had been skyrocketing, it's dropped between 7 and 52%. So this shows you that if we work together, we can actually turn the tide in problem after problem after problem. A second focus of our efforts, and again one that you mentioned in your report, involved a vigorous crackdown on money launderers. We know that without a steady stream of laundered cash, the drug trade will wither. Today, the Treasury Department will take 3 steps to further cut off the cash. We will require currency exchanges, check cashers, and other money services to register with the Treasury Department. We will require more businesses to report suspicious activity under penalty of law, and will require the transfer of funds overseas above $750 to be reported to federal law enforcement. We know this will cut back on money laundering. It will require some efforts at compliance, but it is worth doing. We know if we can get to the money, we can get to the problems very often. Finally, let me ask your help in trying to get the Congress to pass the kind of juvenile justice bill we all know that we need. Organized gangs, armed to the teeth, prowl too many of our streets and threaten too many of our communities, and are part of the drug problem. I have proposed comprehensive legislation modeled on what is working in Boston and many other cities present in this room and around the country that will protect our children better from violence and give local communities the capacity to have safe streets again. The plan will add prosecutors and probation officers, keep schools open longer to keep children off the streets, and we know an awful lot of the problems young people have occur in the first few hours after they get out of school and before they can be home with their parents. It will also require child safety locks on guns. Right now we protect aspirin bottles better than we protect guns. And it would extend the provisions of the Brady Bill to juveniles who commit serious violent crimes. They wouldn't be able to buy a gun when they turn 21. The legislation passed in the House of Representatives contains tougher penalties and more prosecutors, but only about a dozen states qualify. It does not do anything on prevention. It does not make all states available for prosecution, extra prosecutors and probation officers. And it does not deal with the child safety locks or extending the coverage of the Brady Bill to juveniles who commit serious crimes. Now, I believe we ought to get a good juvenile crime bill here that can be actually used in the way the Crime Bill of 1994 and the COPS program are being used by you on the streets. We want to give you something you can use. This bill, like the other ones, was largely written by local officials telling us what should be in the bill. So I do not want this to be a political issue. I do not want this to be a partisan issue. I tried to do this in a very straightforward way based on what those of you who labor in this vineyard every day told me was the right thing to do. So I hope that you will help us do that, continue to make progress on meth, continue to make progress on money laundering. I assure you we will review your plan and your recommendations very closely. And again, let me say, I also hope you'll help us remind the people in your communities that if we want our kids to be drug-free, we all got to work hard to send the right signals. Thank you very much.